Hi, my name is Eric Bannon. I'm a Senior Specialist Solutions Architect with Red Hat, and this is going to be a video covering one of the many features that was just released in the 3.70 GA release of Advanced Cluster Security. So the feature that I'm going to be covering is a policy around notifying whether a deployment is missing an Ingress network policy or not. So if you remember, ACS already provides deep functionality in terms of visualizing pod-to-pod communication, different types of traffic and violations around anomalous activity. The goal of this policy that we just added to the 3.7 release is to notify you whether a deployment is missing a default policy. Now, if it's missing it, what that means is that any communication is allowed. That means any ingress, any egress, it's wide open. Just because I have a namespace does not mean it's an appropriate isolation of my network. And so we've added this policy per customer request to notify you whether or not a deployment is missing that. So if I go under policies and I go to, I'm just going to type in network, and you should see this new policy. Deployments should have at least one ingress network policy. And it's disabled by default because chances are it's probably going to be pretty noisy if it was enabled. What I'm going to do is I'm going to scope this to specific namespaces, and I think this is probably how this will be used the most. In other words, if I have a very important namespace that I want to make sure always has network policies associated with it for my crown jewel applications or my critical applications, this would be a really good example of how you could use this, and maybe even potentially very valuable in things like healthcare, where network segmentation and HIPAA compliance are very critical for PHI data and other types of sensitive information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click the policy. I'm going to go into edit, and I'm going to go under the criteria, or the scope, excuse me. I'm going to add an inclusion scope to my cluster, and I'm going to include it on the payments namespace. And we'll click next. I'm going to save this, then I'm going to enable the policy. So now I should see this policy is enabled in the environment, and it's scoped to a specific sensitive namespace. Now, if I go over to violations, what I should begin to see is that my deployments in my payments namespace are currently violating this. So I can see my gateway, my Visa processor, my MasterCard processor, the violations beginning to work. And what this could do as a security administrator is alert me to actually go to the existing functionality in the network tab and to simulate an ingress policy for this. So I could get notified of this. I could tie this policy to a specific notifier. So if I go back to the policy, I could say, I want to add this to my notifier. I have a generic webhook, so I want to enable this. So all existing functionality where this could go to a SIEM tool or some other external system. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the network graph, and I've got a namespace filter already picked for my payments namespace. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to check for some of the existing flows and network policies that exist within this namespace. So if I go to the active traffic on this now, I'll be able to see my Visa processor, my gateway, my MasterCard processor. But if I go to the allowed traffic, what I'm going to notice is that everything is allowed to and from these pods. So what I want to do is I'm going to focus on one deployment for now. I'm going to focus on the Visa processor, which does not have an existing network policy. So if I click on this and I look at some of its active traffic in the environment, I'll see that it's supposed to get ingress from the gateway, but it also has an anomalous flow from a jump host, and that has no existing network policies on it. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to come over to the policy simulator, and I'm actually going to go under the baseline settings. I'm going to simulate this as a network policy in the environment. And so this should come back and give me a network policy for this. I'm going to download that policy, and typically what you'd usually see is this would actually be implemented probably through some sort of approval process, but you'll see it generated an ingress policy to that gateway. And I'm going to take this policy And I'm going to come over to OpenShift, and I'm actually going to apply this policy. Awesome. So now once I'm in the console, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to actually deploy this into OpenShift. And let me go over and get my policy. And I'm going to create. Now what I should see is if I go back to the ACS console, that's ACM. If I go back to the ACS console, what I should see is I should begin to see this get reflected in the environment. So now where it was red before, I now see that the Visa processor is actually blue, meaning that it's not allowing every single connection. If I come over to this, I should see that it has that network policy applied to it now based on its active traffic, and that it's only going to allow a connection from the gateway. Going back to the violations, I should now see that that violation is no longer in place. I still see a couple for my gateway and my MasterCard processor, but this notification policy is a good way to prompt you to that exercise. It begins the conversation with developers. It begins the conversation with security administrators. And it's in general a good way to notify and get the conversation started on where and how you should be implementing network policies. So I hope you found this useful. If you have questions on how you could potentially demo this like we just did, please don't hesitate to reach out and we will talk to you soon. Thank you.